Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The backyard hummed with laughter and clinking glasses. String lights cast warm pools of light across the deck where 30 guests celebrated Norman and Brielle Granger's 10th wedding anniversary. Norman stood near the grill, turning steaks with mechanical precision while his mind cataloged details. The way Brielle's laugh carried too loud. How she kept checking her phone. The nervous energy radiating from their friend Ashton as he hovered near the bar cart. Norman, honey. Brielle appeared at his elbow, holding 2 wine glasses filled with deep red liquid. Her smile blazed bright enough to power the house, but something cold lived behind her green eyes. I made your favorite. That Bordeaux we bought in France. Norman accepted the glass, noting how her fingers lingered on his. Her manicured nails caught the light like tiny knives. Thanks. To 10 beautiful years, she said, raising her glass, that he lifted his own, but paused. For just a moment, Brielle's mask slipped. Her gaze flicked to his glass with an expression he'd never seen before. Not affection, not celebration. Calculation. Pure, mathematical calculation. The moment passed so quickly he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Almost. Norman, come take pictures. Caroline's voice cut through the crowd. His sister stood by the rose garden, waving him over with typical impatience. She'd never liked Brielle, though she kept her opinions mostly to herself these days. Go ahead, Brielle said, her smile clicking back into place. I'll find Mom. Norman moved toward his sister, but his military training kicked in. The same instincts that had kept him alive in Afghanistan whispered warnings. He stopped at a high-top table where Delia Morgan, Brielle's mother, stood alone, examining her reflection in her compact mirror. Delia, he set his wine glass on the table and picked up hers instead. You look lovely tonight. She snapped the compact shut and smiled. At 58, she still carried herself like the beauty queen she'd been decades ago, though the years had sharpened her features into something predatory. Why, thank you, Norman. You're such a gentleman. He raised her glass. To family, she agreed, lifting his original glass. They drank. The wine tasted normal. Expensive, slightly bitter from the tannins. But within 30 seconds, Delia's face changed. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating. Her hand flew to her throat. I don't, she started, then doubled over. The convulsion started small, a tremor in her hands. Then her whole body seized, wine glass shattering against the deck. Foam appeared at the corners of her mouth as she collapsed, limbs jerking violently. Call 911, someone screamed. The party exploded into chaos. Guests stumbled backward, cell phones appearing in shaking hands. Caroline dropped to her knees beside Delia, checking for a pulse. Ashton appeared from nowhere, face pale as paper. Norman stood perfectly still, watching, studying. His engineering mind processed the scene with clinical detachment. The timing of a seizure, the specific symptoms, the way Brielle pushed through the crowd, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Mom. Oh God, Mom. Brielle collapsed beside her mother's convulsing form. But even as she sobbed, Norman caught her scanning the deck, looking for something. Her gaze swept across the broken glass, then to the high-top table where Norman had left the second wine glass. The glass was gone. Brielle's sobs hiccuped for just a moment. Her head snapped up, eyes finding Norman's across the chaos. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other. Then her mask slammed back into place, and she was the devastated daughter again. EMTs arrived in a screaming rush of sirens and flashing lights. They worked over Delia with professional efficiency, pumping her stomach, starting IVs, loading her onto a stretcher. What did she eat? Any known allergies? The lead paramedic fired questions while his partner prepared medications. Nothing unusual, Brielle said through her tears. Just wine. She was fine 5 minutes ago. Norman said nothing. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching his wife lie with Academy Award precision. When the ambulance pulled away, Brielle collapsed against him, her body shaking with sobs. I can't lose her, Norman. I can't. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the heat of her skin through the silk dress. To everyone watching, he was the supportive husband. Inside, his mind worked like a computer, filing away evidence. The missing glass, Brielle's searching look, the convenient tears that started before she even reached her mother. "She'll be okay," he murmured into her hair. "Delia is stronger than she looks." But as he held his trembling wife, Norman Granger knew exactly who was stronger than they looked. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and despair. Norman sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the CNN ticker scrolling across the mounted television. Beside him, Brielle clutched a tissue box, dabbing at eyes that produced tears on command. "The doctors say she's stable," she whispered. "But they don't know what caused it. They're running more tests." Norman nodded, his face a mask of concern. Inside, he was calculating. If Delia had been poisoned, and every instinct told him she had, then someone had planned this carefully. Someone with access to the wine. Someone who knew exactly which glass would end up in which hands. Someone who hadn't expected him to switch them. "I should call work," he said. "Tell them I won't be in tomorrow." "You don't have to stay," Brielle said quickly. "I know you have that big project. My wife's mother is fighting for her life. The project can wait." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment? Frustration? It passed too quickly to be sure. Doctor Martinez appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Granger, your mother is stable. We've induced a coma to let her brain recover from the trauma. It could be several days before we know more." Brielle dissolved into fresh tears. Norman thanked the doctor and guided his sobbing wife toward the exit. But as they walked through the parking garage, his mind was already 3 steps ahead. The next morning, Norman called his foreman and took emergency leave. 20 years of steady work had earned him that flexibility. He told everyone he needed time to process the trauma, to support his wife through the crisis that in reality, he needed time to investigate. His home office sat in the basement, a refuge of filing cabinets and computer screens where he managed his contracting business. Now it became something else. A war room. He started with the obvious things. Brielle's laptop, left open on the kitchen counter. Her password had always been their anniversary date, not exactly sophisticated security. Her email revealed the usual suburban drama. Shopping confirmations, yoga class schedules, gossip threads with her friends. But buried in her deleted items, he found threads that made his blood freeze. Messages with Ashton dating back 8 months. Not the casual exchanges of family friends. These dripped with intimacy, with secret plans and coded language that can't wait to see you tonight. Same place as last time. He's working late again. We have until 10. After this weekend, everything changes. Norman screenshotted every message, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of shared dreams, joint bank accounts, and whispered promises. All of it a lie. He moved to her phone, installing spyware with the same precision he used for electrical systems. The software ran invisible, capturing every call, every text, every photo. Within hours, data flowed to a secure server he'd set up using skills learned in Army intelligence. The cloud backup revealed even more. Photos she'd thought were private. Hotel receipts charged to a credit card he'd never seen. Purchases from pharmacies in counties they'd never visited together. But the most damning evidence came from her text messages with unknown numbers. Conversations about supplies and dosages and making sure there's no trace. Norman printed everything, built files, created timelines. His engineering brain turned the fragments into a clear picture, and that picture made him sick. His wife wasn't just cheating on him. She was planning to kill him. Caroline's house smelled like coffee and suspicion. Norman's younger sister had always been the family skeptic, the one who asked uncomfortable questions at Christmas dinner. Now she sat across from him at her kitchen table, studying the printed evidence he'd spread between them. "Jesus Christ, Norman." She looked up from a particularly explicit text exchange. "How long has this been going on?" 8 months, maybe longer. The electronic trail only goes back so far. Caroline pushed the papers away like they carried disease. "And you think she tried to poison you at the party?" "I know she did. The question is whether this was her first attempt. His sister stood and paced to the window, arms crossed tight across her chest. Outside, her neighbors tended their perfect suburban lawns, oblivious to the darkness being discussed 20 feet away. "There's something else," Caroline said without turning around. "Something I never told you." Norman waited. "Remember Dad's birthday party 2 years ago? The one where Brielle got so drunk she could barely stand. She had food poisoning the next day. Spent 3 days in bed." "That's what she said." Caroline turned back to face him. "But I saw her in Dad's study that night. She was going through his desk. When she saw me, she claimed she was looking for aspirin, but Norman, Dad, kept his medications in the bathroom cabinet. She knew that." The words hit Norman like a physical blow. Their father had died 6 weeks after that party. Sudden stroke, the doctors said. Unexpected, but not impossible for a 72-year-old man with high blood pressure. "You think she—" "I think Dad caught her stealing something. Pills, maybe. Or documents. And I think she made sure he couldn't tell anyone." Norman's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I had no proof. Just a feeling, and you were so happy with her. I thought maybe I was being paranoid." Caroline sat back down, her voice breaking. "God, Norman, if I'd said something, he'd still be dead. But now we know why." He pulled out his phone and called the county coroner's office. After 20 minutes of transfers and explanations, he reached Dr. Patricia Webb, the pathologist who'd performed their father's autopsy. "Mr. Granger, yes, I remember your father's case. Very straightforward stroke presentation. Doctor, I need to ask you about the toxicology results." A pause. "We didn't run comprehensive toxicology. At his age, with his medical history, there was no indication of foul play. What if there was? Hypothetically, would you still have samples?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Granger, is there something specific you'd like to tell me?" Norman looked at his sister, at the evidence scattered across the table, at the weight of terrible knowledge pressing down on his shoulders. "I think my father was murdered." Dr. Webb agreed to meet them that afternoon. The coroner's office occupied a sterile building that smelled like formaldehyde and secrets. Dr. Webb, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair, led them to a small conference room. "I pulled your father's file," she said, opening a thick folder. "Standard autopsy for his age and circumstances. Significant arteriosclerosis, evidence of previous minor cardiac events. The stroke was massive but not unprecedented. What about the blood work? Basic panel only. We tested for common drugs, alcohol, nothing exotic." She flipped through pages of lab results. "But now that you mention it, there were a few anomalies I noted but didn't pursue. Such as, his liver enzymes were elevated beyond what I'd expect from his medication regimen. And there were trace amounts of a compound I couldn't identify. I assumed it was a metabolite from one of his prescriptions." Norman leaned forward. "Could you identify it now? If you knew what to look for?" Dr. Webb studied his face. "Mr. Granger, what aren't you telling me?" He pulled out his phone and showed her screenshots of Brielle's text messages. The ones about supplies and dosages. The ones that used words like untraceable and natural causes. Dr. Webb's expression hardened as she read. "I'll need to run additional tests. It'll take a few days, but if your father was poisoned with something exotic, we might still be able to detect metabolites. And if you find something, then we have a murder case." Norman drove home through suburban streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning. Same manicured lawns, same perfect houses, same illusion of safety. But everything had changed. The woman he'd shared a bed with for 10 years wasn't just an adulterer. She was a killer, and if Dr. Webb found what he expected her to find, Brielle had killed his father. The house felt different when he walked through the front door. Every family photo on the mantel seemed to mock him. Every shared memory turned sinister under the weight of new knowledge. In the kitchen, he found a note from Brielle. "Gone to hospital to sit with Mom. Home late. Love you, love." The word tasted like poison in his mouth. Norman poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his father's old chair, the one Brielle had always hated, had always wanted to replace. Now he understood why. Every time she looked at it, she saw her victim. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Webb. Preliminary results show presence of exotic alkaloids consistent with plant-based neurotoxins. We'll have full analysis tomorrow. Norman stared at the message until the letters blurred together. Then he deleted it and finished his bourbon. His father was dead. His wife was a murderer. And tomorrow, he would start planning his revenge. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and impending death. Norman sat beside Delia's bed, watching machines breathe for her while her daughter wept convincingly in the hallway. After 3 days in a medically induced coma, the doctors had begun reducing her sedation. She would wake soon. Norman wanted to be there when she did. The monitors beeped steadily as Delia's eyelids fluttered. She groaned, tried to speak around the breathing tube, then focused on Norman's face with surprising clarity. "Welcome back," he said quietly. The nurses came quickly, removing tubes and checking vitals. Delia cooperated with professional politeness, but her eyes never left Norman's face. When they were finally alone, she cleared her throat and smiled. "That was unpleasant." "I imagine it was. The doctors say I had some kind of reaction. Food poisoning, maybe, or bad wine." Her voice carried a question. Norman leaned back in his chair, studying her. Even after nearly dying, Delia Morgan radiated a predatory elegance. Her silver hair lay perfectly styled despite 3 days of unconsciousness. Her makeup had been refreshed, probably by Betrayal during visiting hours. "Funny thing about that wine," he said. "We bought it together in France. Been saving it for a special occasion. Anniversary parties are certainly special." "They are. Though I have to admit, I was surprised when you had such a violent reaction to it." Delia's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. "These things happen. At my age, you never know what might disagree with you, especially when it's not meant for you." The words hung in the air between them like a blade. Delia's hands smoothed the hospital blanket with careful precision. When she looked up again, the maternal mask had slipped away entirely. "You're a clever man, Norman. I've always respected that about you. Not clever enough, apparently. How long have you two been planning this?" "Planning what?" "My murder." Delia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You have an active imagination. I have evidence. Photos, texts, financial records. I know about the affairs, the fake purchases, the contacts with your supplier. I know you killed my father. Prove it." The challenge hung between them like a thrown gauntlet. Norman reached into his jacket and pulled out a digital recorder, setting it on the bedside table. The red light blinked steadily. "Here's what I think happened," he said. "You and Betrayal have been doing this for years. Find a target, marry him, drain his resources, then eliminate him when he becomes inconvenient. My father caught Betrayal going through his personal papers, so you accelerated the timeline. Killed him before he could expose you." Delia's expression remained pleasant, but her knuckles went white where she gripped the blanket. "Then you set your sights on me. Bigger target, more money, better insurance policy. But you made a mistake at the party. You let me see the calculation in Betrayal's eyes when she handed me that glass. You're delusional." "Am I?" "Then explain the plant alkaloids in your bloodstream. Explain the credit card purchases for compounds that don't exist in any legitimate pharmacy. Explain why your daughter has been sleeping with our family friend for 8 months." Delia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality. Harder, more honest. "You weren't supposed to be the target originally, Norman. That was never the plan. No, Betrayal was supposed to marry someone else. Someone weaker, more pliable. But you came along with your steady income and your army discipline and your convenient lack of family. And she convinced me you'd be perfect." "Perfect for what?" "For practice. You were supposed to be easy. A test run before we went after bigger game." Delia's smile turned sharp as a scalpel. "But you've always been inconvenient, haven't you? Always watching, always thinking, always in the way." Norman stopped the recording and put the device back in his pocket. "Thank you for the confession. You think you're clever, but you don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes back decades, Norman. Generations. My mother taught me, and I taught Betrayal. We are apex predators in a world full of stupid, trusting men. We're what? We're apex predators. Past tense. Because now I know exactly what you are, and I'm going to destroy you. Delia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You can't prove anything that will stick in court. At best, you have circumstantial evidence and a recording of a woman recovering from a traumatic poisoning. Any lawyer will argue I was disoriented, confused. Maybe, but I don't need a court conviction to ruin your lives. What's that supposed to mean? Norman stood, straightening his jacket. It means you raised a daughter who thinks she's smarter than everyone else. But I was analyzing enemy positions and planning tactical strikes while she was learning to put on makeup. This is what I do, Delia. I solve problems. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and next time you try to kill someone, make sure they drink the right glass. The address led Norman to a rundown apartment complex on the wrong side of Louisville. Peeling paint, broken windows, cars that hadn't moved in months. This was where John Renshaw lived now, though 5 years ago he'd owned a construction company worth millions. Norman climbed concrete stairs that smelled like urine and despair. Apartment 3B had no nameplate, just a number hanging crooked on a door that had seen better decades. He knocked. Who is it? My name is Norman Granger. I'm married to Betrayal Morgan. I think we need to talk. Silence. Then the sound of multiple locks turning. The door opened to reveal a man who might have been handsome once. Now John Renshaw looked like a scarecrow dressed in human clothes. Thin to the point of starvation, unshaven, wearing a t-shirt with holes and stains. Betrayal Morgan, John repeated slowly. Haven't heard that name in a while. Though I guess it's Betrayal Granger now. Can I come in? John stepped aside. The apartment was surprisingly clean given the building's condition, but sparse. A couch, a TV, a card table with 2 folding chairs. The refrigerator hummed with the sound of machinery on its last legs. Coffee? John asked. It's instant, but it's hot. Please. They sat at the card table while John stirred coffee crystals into chipped mugs. Up close, Norman could see the man had once been substantial. Broad shoulders, strong hands. The kind of build that came from physical work and good nutrition. Now he looked like a ghost of himself. So you married little Betrayal? John said. How long? 10 years. Jesus. She usually doesn't keep them that long. How long did she keep you? John laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was engaged to her mother, not her. Delia Morgan, back when she was still calling herself Delia Hartwell. This was 7 years ago. Met her at a charity function. She was volunteering, seemed like a good woman. Recently widowed, raising a daughter alone. What happened? What always happens with women like that? Started slow. Little things. Could I help with her mortgage payment? Just this once? Could I co-sign a loan for Betrayal's college? Before I knew it, I was paying for everything. Their rent, their cars, their shopping trips. Norman sipped the bitter coffee and waited. Then the accusations started. I was controlling, possessive. I had a temper. I was emotionally abusive. Complete bullshit, but Delia was convincing. She had this way of making you doubt your own memories. Did you call it off? I tried to. That's when things got interesting. John stood and walked to a filing cabinet that looked like he'd rescued it from a dumpster. He pulled out a thick folder and returned to the table. Police reports, he said, spreading papers across the surface. Domestic violence complaints. Harassment charges. Stalking allegations. All filed by sweet, innocent Delia Morgan. Norman scanned the documents. A pattern emerged immediately. Every time John tried to distance himself from Delia, she escalated the legal pressure. Restraining orders. Court appearances. Character witnesses who painted him as dangerous and unstable. None of it stuck, John continued. Prosecutors could tell the charges were garbage. But the damage was done. Word got around that I was a woman beater. Clients canceled contracts. Suppliers demanded cash up front. My own employees started looking at me sideways. What about your business? Gone. Had to liquidate everything to pay legal fees. Delia made sure the court battles dragged on for months. Every time I got close to clearing my name, she'd file new charges. Norman studied John's face. The man was telling the truth. Norman could see it in the way his hands shook slightly, the way his voice carried old pain that hadn't quite healed. How did it end? She found a new target. Some doctor from Chicago. Dropped all the charges overnight and moved away. Left me with nothing but a reputation I'll never get back. And Brielle. Sweet little Brielle was part of the act from day one. Played the concerned daughter, worried about her mother's safety. She's the one who convinced me Delia needed protection, needed someone strong to take care of her. John's voice turned bitter. She's the one who suggested I take out life insurance policies. To protect Delia if anything happened to me. The words hit Norman like a sledgehammer. Life insurance. Of course. How much? $2 million. Term policy with Delia as beneficiary. She said it would give her peace of mind. Norman pulled out his phone and scrolled through his own insurance documents. There was a $5 million policy he'd signed 3 years ago. Brielle had suggested it, said they needed to protect their future together. They were going to kill you, Norman said quietly. Probably, but they found easier prey first. John gathered up the police reports with hands that trembled. Why are you here, Norman? What's your angle? They tried to poison me 5 days ago. Missed and got Delia instead. John stared at him for a long moment. Then he started laughing. Not the bitter sound from before, but genuine amusement. They poisoned the wrong person? Jesus Christ, that's beautiful. How's the old witch doing? Recovered. Talking. Probably planning her next move. And you're here because I'm going to destroy them. But I need to understand the full scope of what they've been doing. John leaned back in his chair, studying Norman with new interest. You want revenge. I want justice. Same thing in my experience. What do you need from me? Everything. Every document, every detail, every piece of evidence you have. I'm building a case that will put them both in prison for the rest of their lives. What makes you think you could succeed where I failed? Norman met his eyes. Because I'm not trying to defend myself from false accusations. I'm going on the offensive. And because they made the mistake of targeting someone who knows how to fight back. John was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, but I want something in return. What? When you destroy them, I want to be there to watch. The Riverside Motel squatted beside the highway like a guilty secret. Norman sat in his truck in the parking lot across the street, camera with telephoto lens ready. He'd been following Ashton for 3 days, learning his patterns. Every Tuesday and Thursday, their family friend drove 20 minutes outside the city to this monument to adultery. At T2:17 p.m., Brielle's silver Lexus pulled into the motel parking lot. Norman started taking pictures. Through the lens, he watched his wife of 10 years climb out of her car, wearing a dress he'd bought her for their anniversary. She looked around quickly, then hurried to room 237. Ashton opened the door before she could knock. The kiss they shared wasn't the peck of family friends. It was hungry, desperate, full of barely contained need. Norman captured it all in high definition that he'd installed tracking software on both their phones, so he knew they usually stayed 90 minutes. Enough time to drive to an electronics store and buy a listening device the size of a quarter. Enough time to return and attach it to the underside of Ashton's car while the happy couple was occupied. Norman drove home and waited. At 6:30 p.m., his phone chimed with an alert. The listening device had activated. He put on headphones and started recording. Have to be more careful. Ashton's voice tense with anxiety. Why? Norman doesn't suspect anything. Brielle sounded relaxed, satisfied. He's been so worried about Mom that he barely notices I exist. Your mother almost died, Brie. Doesn't that bother you at all? She didn't die, and it worked out perfectly. Now Norman thinks someone's targeting our family. He's being protective instead of suspicious. Norman's hands clenched into fists. Even now, even caught red-handed, she was manipulating the situation to her advantage. What if he figures it out? He won't. Norman's smart about engineering and construction, but he's clueless about people. He still thinks I married him for love. Ashton laughed nervously. Why did you marry him? Because he was convenient. Stable income, good insurance, no family to ask questions when he disappeared. Plus, he actually cared about me, which made him easy to control. And now he's served his purpose. Rufus says the next dose will be undetectable. Natural heart attack from overwork and stress. Very believable for a man his age. Norman's blood turned to ice. They were discussing his murder like a grocery list. When? Ashton asked. Soon. I'm thinking during his next big project. He always works late, comes home exhausted. Perfect setup for cardiac event. Then I collect $5 million in insurance money, and we disappear to somewhere without extradition treaties. What about your mother? What about her? She served her purpose too. Time for her to have an accident of her own. Norman stopped the recording and sat in stunned silence. Not only were they planning to kill him, they were planning to eliminate Delia as well. The student had become the teacher. His phone buzzed with a text message. From Betrayal, working late at the gallery. Don't wait up, the gallery. Another lie. According to the tracking software, she was at Ashton's apartment. Norman forwarded the audio file to 3 different email accounts, stored copies on multiple drives, and uploaded everything to a secure cloud server. Then he started planning. The next morning, he called his sister. I need you to do something for me, he said without preamble. What kind of something? The kind that might get you in trouble if anyone asks where the information came from. Caroline was quiet for a moment. This is about Betrayal. This is about saving my life. What do you need? Norman gave her screenshots of text messages between Betrayal and Ashton. The most explicit ones, the ones that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. He also sent her contact information for Kendra Vaughn, Betrayal's best friend and the unofficial head of their neighborhood gossip network. Send these to Kendra. Make it look like you received them by accident, like someone meant to forward them to someone else, but hit your name instead. Norman, this will destroy her reputation. That's the point. I want her isolated, desperate, backed into a corner. Predators are most dangerous when they think they're trapped. Caroline forwarded the messages within an hour. By evening, Norman's phone was buzzing with calls from neighbors, friends, and acquaintances. Word was spreading through their social circle like wildfire. When Betrayal came home at 9 p.m., she was crying. Everyone knows, she sobbed, collapsing into his arms. Someone leaked private messages. The whole neighborhood is talking about it. Norman held her while she wept, marveling at her ability to generate tears on demand. Even now, even caught in adultery, she was playing the victim. It's going to be okay, he murmured. We'll get through this. How can you forgive me? She whispered against his chest. Because I love you. Because everyone makes mistakes. The lies tasted like ashes in his mouth, but they served a purpose. Betrayal needed to believe he was still the trusting, forgiving husband she'd manipulated for 10 years. She needed to think her secret was safe, because Norman Granger was about to show her exactly how dangerous an angry engineer could be. That Norman's lawyer looked exactly like Central Casting would order for competent attorney. Gray hair, expensive suit, office that smelled like leather and quiet confidence. James Morrison had handled Norman's business contracts for years, but today's meeting was different. I want to restructure everything, Norman said, sliding documents across the mahogany desk. Bank accounts, investments, property deeds, insurance beneficiaries. All of it. Morrison adjusted his glasses and scanned the papers. This is pretty comprehensive, Norman. Mind if I ask what prompted this? Let's call it estate planning. Estate planning usually doesn't involve removing your wife from every legal document. Norman met his eyes. My wife is having an affair. I have reason to believe she's planning something that could put my assets at risk. It wasn't quite the truth, but it was close enough for legal purposes. Morrison nodded slowly. All right, we can set up a family trust with your sister as trustee. Transfer everything into the trust name. If something happens to you, Caroline controls the assets according to your specifications. How long will it take? 2 weeks if we push it. Push it. Norman spent the next 3 days liquidating everything quietly. Joint savings accounts, investment portfolios, the emergency fund they'd built over 10 years of marriage. He moved it all to new accounts in the trust name, leaving just enough in their shared checking to avoid suspicion. Betrayal never noticed. She was too busy managing the social fallout from her exposed affair, too focused on damage control to pay attention to bank statements that on Thursday morning, Norman told her he was going fishing. Alone? She asked, looking up from her laptop where she was deleting angry comments from her Facebook page. I need time to think. Process everything that's happened. How long will you be gone? A week, maybe longer. Depends on how the fish are biting. Relief flickered across her face before she could hide it. That sounds good. You need space to heal. Norman packed carefully. Fishing gear, camping supplies, enough food for a week in the wilderness. He even bought a fishing license and made reservations at a state park 3 hours away. Everything had to look legitimate, but instead of driving to the lake, he checked into a motel under a false name and began surveillance. The tracking software on Brielle's phone showed her movements in real time. Wednesday afternoon, she drove to Ashton's apartment and stayed for 3 hours. Thursday, she visited a pawn shop in a rough part of town, the same address where she'd made mysterious purchases months earlier. Friday evening, she met with a man Norman didn't recognize. Heavy build, prison tattoos visible on his arms, the kind of face that belonged on wanted posters. They talked for 10 minutes in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant, then parted ways. Norman followed the stranger to a rundown house on the east side. A quick internet search of the address revealed the owner, Rufus Cade, recently released after serving 8 years for manufacturing and distributing controlled substances, the supplier. The man who'd provided whatever poison they tried to use at the anniversary party. Norman photographed everything. The house, the license plate, Rufus himself when he came outside to smoke. Then he settled in to wait. His phone buzzed with a text from Brielle. "Miss you. Hope the fishing is good," he replied. "Peaceful here. Need more time to think. Take all the time you need. I love you." Norman stared at those 3 words for a long time. Once, they'd meant everything to him. Now, they were just another lie in a marriage built on deception. Saturday morning, Brielle's phone moved to an address Norman recognized: Delia's house. His mother-in-law had been released from the hospital the day before, supposedly to recover at home. Through his telephoto lens, Norman watched Brielle arrive, carrying a covered dish, playing the devoted daughter. But the meeting lasted 4 hours, and when she left, she was carrying a small package. That evening, Rufus Cade received a visitor. Norman photographed Ashton entering the drug dealer's house, staying for 20 minutes, then leaving with what looked like a prescription bottle. The pieces were falling into place. They had their poison. They had their plan. All they needed was for Norman to come home from his fishing trip. Sunday night, he called Brielle. "How's the fishing?" "Terrible. Haven't caught anything worth keeping." "Poor baby. When are you coming home?" "Tomorrow, I think. I miss sleeping in my own bed." "I miss you too. I'll cook your favorite dinner." "That sounds perfect." Norman hung up and made final preparations. Hidden cameras throughout the house, voice recorders in key locations, backup copies of all evidence stored in multiple secure locations. He'd even written a detailed confession explaining everything he discovered to be automatically emailed to the police if he failed to check in every 12 hours. Then he drove home to face his would-be murderers. The house looked exactly the same as when he'd left it. Same manicured lawn, same perfect exterior, same illusion of suburban happiness. But now Norman could see past the facade to the rot underneath. Brielle met him at the door with tears in her eyes and arms outstretched. "I'm so sorry," she whispered as she hugged him. "I know I've hurt you terribly. We'll work through it," he said, noting how she trembled against him. "With guilt? With anticipation? We have to try. I made reservations at Romano's for Friday night. Just the 2 of us. We need to talk about our future." Romano's, the restaurant where they'd had their first date, where he'd proposed 5 years later. She was planning to kill him somewhere meaningful, somewhere that would add emotional weight to her widowhood. "That sounds wonderful," Norman said, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Brielle. I love you too." The lies came so easily now. But then, they'd both been lying for a long time. Norman stood in Delia's kitchen, watching his wife arrange flowers in a crystal vase. The kitchen looked like something from a magazine: granite countertops, professional appliances, window treatments that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything perfect on the surface, hiding the rot beneath. "These are beautiful," Brielle said, adjusting white roses with practiced ease. "Mom always loved flowers." "Where is she?" "Resting upstairs. The hospital stay took a lot out of her." Norman nodded, though he knew from the surveillance equipment he'd installed that Delia had spent the morning on the phone with someone discussing final preparations. She wasn't resting. She was planning. "I thought we could have dinner here tonight," Brielle continued. "Just family. Mom needs cheering up, and we need to start healing as a family." "Who's coming?" "Just us, Mom, Caroline, and a few close friends. Ashton said he'd stop by to check on Mom. And there's someone new I'd like you to meet, Rufus. He's a business associate of Mom's. Norman's blood chilled. They were bringing their poison supplier to dinner, making it a family affair. Sounds perfect, he said. What can I do to help? The afternoon passed in careful choreography. Norman helped with preparations while mentally cataloging every detail. The wine glasses Betrayal selected heavy crystal that would be difficult to switch unnoticed. The place settings that put him at the head of the table, isolated from potential allies. The way Betrayal kept checking her phone, coordinating with unseen conspirators. At 6 p.m., the guests began arriving. Caroline came first, carrying a bottle of wine and a suspicious expression. She hugged Norman tightly and whispered in his ear, "Are you sure about this?" "Trust me," he whispered back. Ashton arrived next, nervous energy radiating from every pore. He shook Norman's hand with damp palms and avoided eye contact. "Good to see you, buddy. How was the fishing trip?" "Enlightening." Kendra Vaughn appeared with a casserole dish and uncomfortable silence. Since the affair revelation, she'd been caught between loyalty to Betrayal and her own moral compass. She kissed Betrayal's cheek with obvious reluctance. The last guest made Norman's skin crawl. Rufus Cade looked exactly like what he was, a career criminal in an ill-fitting suit. He introduced himself as a friend of the family and sat where Betrayal directed him, directly across from Norman. Delia descended the stairs like a queen granting an audience. She dressed carefully for the occasion: black dress, pearls, makeup applied with artistic precision. She looked like a woman recovering from traumatic accident. She looked like a grieving mother-in-law preparing to console her daughter's widow. "Norman, dear." She kissed his cheek with lips that fell like ice. "Thank you for organizing this. Family gatherings are so important during difficult times." They sat around the mahogany dining table while Betrayal served her famous pot roast. Norman had eaten this meal hundreds of times, but tonight it tasted like cardboard. Every bite might be his last. Conversation flowed around topics carefully chosen to avoid tension. The weather, local news, safe subjects that wouldn't trigger arguments or suspicion. But Norman could feel undercurrents of electricity, the barely controlled energy of predators preparing to strike. "Let's have a toast," Delia said when they reached dessert. "To family, to healing, to new beginnings." Betrayal stood and began filling wine glasses from a bottle of expensive Bordeaux. Norman watched her hands, looking for anything unusual. A slight tremor, a moment of hesitation. But she poured with steady precision, saving his glass for last. When she handed it to him, her fingers brushed his for just a moment. Her skin felt feverish. "To family," Norman said, raising his glass. The wine tasted normal. Rich, complex, slightly bitter from the tannins. But within minutes, Norman felt something wrong. A slight burning in his throat, a flutter in his chest. He set down his glass and reached for his water, but his hand was shaking. "Are you all right?" Caroline asked, her voice sharp with concern. Norman tried to respond, but his voice came out as a croak. His throat was closing, his airway constricting. He clutched at his collar, gasping for breath. "Oh God!" Betrayal screamed, jumping up from her chair. "He's allergic to nuts." There must have been nuts in the dessert. But Norman wasn't allergic to nuts, had never been allergic to anything. This was the poison, the same substance that had nearly killed Delia at the anniversary party. His vision blurred as he collapsed to the floor, convulsions racking his body. Through the chaos of screaming voices and scraping chairs, he heard Betrayal sobbing, "Call 911. Someone call 911. But no one moved toward a phone. No one seemed surprised by his sudden collapse. Everyone sat frozen, watching him die. Everyone except Caroline. "I already called them," she said calmly. "And I called the police too." The room went silent except for Norman's labored breathing. "What?" Betrayal's voice cracked. "Why would you call the police?" "Because I know what you did. What you've all been doing." Norman's convulsions slowed, then stopped. He lay still on the Persian rug, foam drying at the corners of his mouth. To anyone watching, he looked dead. Betrayal dropped to her knees beside him, her sobs echoing through the room. No. Not like this." But Norman was very much alive. The poison had been nothing more than a mild emetic that induced temporary symptoms. The foam was toothpaste. The convulsions were Oscar-worthy acting that he'd learned a few things during his week of surveillance, including the fact that Rufus Cade was more interested in money than loyalty, and that a man facing 20 years for murder might be willing to sell out his employers for the right price. Norman sat up slowly, wiping fake foam from his mouth with the back of his hand. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to have stopped ticking. Brielle's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, then a rage so pure it transformed her features into something inhuman. "You son of a bitch," she whispered. "Language, dear," Norman said, climbing to his feet. "We have guests." Ashton bolted for the door, but Carline was already there, turning the deadbolt and pocketing the key. Through the window, red and blue lights strobed across the front yard as police cars filled the driveway. "Sit down, Ash," Norman said conversationally. "We're not finished here." "What is this?" Delia demanded, her composure cracking. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" "The kind where I don't die and you all go to prison." Norman walked to the sideboard and opened a drawer, pulling out a digital recorder and a manila envelope. "I've been documenting your activities for quite some time now." He pressed play on the recorder. Brielle's voice filled the room, crystal clear. "Norman's smart about engineering and construction, but he's clueless about people. He still thinks I married him for love." Brielle went pale. "Where did you get that?" "Your boyfriend's car." Amazing what technology can do these days. Norman opened the envelope and began spreading photographs across the dining table. "These are from your romantic meetings at the Riverside Motel. These are from your visits to Rufus here. And these," he placed a series of bank statements on the table. "These show how you've been systematically draining accounts belonging to previous victims." Detective Ray Collins knocked on the front door. Norman had worked with Collins on construction project for the city. They developed a professional relationship built on mutual respect. "Come in, Ray," Norman called. Doors unlocked now. Collins entered with two uniformed officers, his expression grim. "Norman, we got your call. What's the situation?" "Multiple charges. Attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and at least one count of actual murder." Norman picked up another photo from the table. "This is John Renshaw, Delia's former fiancé. They destroyed his life and were planning to kill him before they found easier targets." "You can't prove any of this," Delia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can." Norman turned to address Rufus directly. "Would you like to tell Detective Collins about the arrangement you made with these ladies? Or should I play the recording of our conversation from yesterday?" Rufus looked around the room like a trapped animal, then focused on Collins' badge. "I want to make a deal." "Shut up," Brielle hissed. "Lady, I ain't going down for murder. Not for you or anybody else." Rufus stood slowly, hands visible. "Detective, I got information about multiple homicides. These women have been poisoning people for years." Collins nodded to one of the uniforms, who began reading Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent," but none of them remained silent. The moment handcuffs appeared, the accusations started flying. "This is all Delia's idea." Brielle screamed. "She made me do it. She threatened to hurt me if I didn't cooperate. I never touched anyone." Delia shot back. "Brielle is the one who insisted on killing your father. I told her it was too risky." Ashton tried a different approach. "I never knew what they were planning. I thought it was just an affair. When they told me about the poison, I tried to back out." Norman watched the dissolution with professional detachment. Faced with consequences, their alliance crumbled instantly. Each turned on the others with vicious self-preservation. Detective Collins separated them into different rooms for individual questioning. Norman provided copies of all his evidence recordings, photographs, financial documents, testimony from previous victims like John Renshaw. "This is impressive work," Collins said privately. "You could have been a detective. I had good motivation." "How long have you known?" "Suspected for a week. Knew for certain after the anniversary party. But I needed proof that would stick in court." Collins reviewed the evidence again, whistling softly. "Yeah, this'll stick. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud. They're looking at life without parole. Through the window, Norman watched EMTs load Delia into an ambulance not because she was injured, but because she collapsed when she realized the scope of evidence against her. Brielle sat in the back of a police car, makeup streaked with tears, screaming threats at anyone who would listen. Ashton had already been taken to the station, along with Rufus. "What happens now?" Caroline asked, putting her arm around Norman's shoulders. "Now they face justice," Norman said, "and I start over." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when Norman emerged from the final sentencing hearing. 18 months had passed since that night at Delia's house. 18 months of legal proceedings, media attention, and gradual healing. The verdicts had been unanimous and brutal. Delia Morgan, life without parole for first-degree murder in the death of Norman's father, plus additional sentences for conspiracy and fraud. Brielle Granger, life without parole for attempted murder and conspiracy, plus 25 years for insurance fraud and the systematic targeting of previous victims. Ashton Marlowe, 40 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder. Rufus Cade had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but even with the deal, he'd gotten 25 years. "Mr. Granger," a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "How does it feel to see justice served?" Norman stopped and faced the cameras. Over the past year and a half, he'd learned to handle media attention with the same precision he applied to engineering problems. "It feels like closure," he said simply. "These women destroyed multiple lives over many years. Today's sentences ensure they can never hurt anyone else. What's next for you?" "I'm focused on rebuilding, starting fresh." He declined further questions and walked to his truck, where Caroline waited with the engine running. "How do you feel?" she asked as they pulled away from the courthouse. "Free." The business had thrived during the legal proceedings. Norman had renamed it Granger and Stone Construction in honor of his father, and the company had grown from a one-man operation to a firm employing 12 people. The house where he'd lived with Brielle had been sold, the proceeds donated to a victims advocacy group. He'd bought a smaller place across town, somewhere without poisonous memories. The divorce had been finalized while Brielle sat in county jail awaiting trial. She tried to claim half of everything, but Norman's careful financial planning had made that impossible. The trust structure protected his assets, and her criminal conviction voided any claim to community property. She'd gotten nothing. Exactly what she deserved. That evening, Norman sat in O'Malley's pub, the same bar where they'd held the anniversary party that started everything. The owner had offered to host a celebration dinner for the legal team, but Norman had declined. He wasn't celebrating. He was simply moving forward. Another bourbon? The bartender was new, a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile. "Please, make it a double." She poured carefully, sliding the glass across polished wood. Celebrating something, surviving something. Sometimes that's the same thing. Norman studied her face. Pretty, but not artificially so. Genuine smile that reached her eyes. The kind of woman who probably told the truth most of the time, who paid her own bills and didn't see other people as resources to be exploited. "I'm Emma," she said, extending her hand. "Norman." They shook hands briefly. Her grip was firm, honest. No calculating pressure, no lingering contact designed to manipulate. "Buy you a drink when you get off work?" Norman asked. Emma smiled, but shook her head. "Thanks, but I don't date customers. Bad policy in this business." "I understand." She moved down the bar to serve other patrons, and Norman finished his bourbon slowly. Outside, Louisville's downtown lights twinkled like stars, and traffic moved in predictable patterns. The world kept turning, indifferent to human suffering and triumph alike. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, his heart raced. Prison inmates sometimes found ways to send messages. But the text was innocent enough. "Congratulations on your victory. You deserve happiness." IT was signed Jr. John Renshaw, the man whose life Delia and Brielle had destroyed years before Norman ever met them. He'd testified at the trial, his courage helping to secure the convictions. Norman deleted the message without replying. Some connections were better left in the past. He paid his tab and walked to his truck. noting how Emma watched him leave. Not with calculation or predatory interest, but with simple human curiosity. Maybe someday, when enough time had passed, when he'd learned to trust again, they might have a conversation that lasted longer than drink orders. But not tonight. Tonight, he went home to his quiet house, to his books, and his solitude, and his carefully rebuilt life. He'd learned important lessons about the masks people wear, about the difference between love and manipulation, about the price of trust freely given. Norman Granger would never be naive again. But perhaps, someday, he might learn to be happy. 1 year after the sentencing, Norman sat in the same booth at O'Malley's where he'd sat that night after the trial. The pub looked different. Now new management had renovated, updated the decor, brought in live music on weekends. Even the bartender was different. Emma had been promoted to manager. She nodded hello when he walked in, professional but friendly. No longer the barrier of customer and employee between them. But Norman had made no move to bridge the gap. Some distances were comfortable. "You're becoming a regular," she said, sliding a bourbon across the table without being asked. "Creature of habit. Nothing wrong with that. Consistency is underrated." She started to walk away, then paused. "Mind if I sit for a minute? It's been a long day." Norman gestured to the empty seat across from him. Emma sat with a tired sigh, pulling the pins from her hair and letting it fall to her shoulders. "Better," she said. "Sometimes I forget how heavy those things can be." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the evening crowd filter in. Young professionals grabbing drinks after work, older couples on date nights. The usual mix of humanity seeking connection and escape. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said, "and feel free to tell me it's none of my business." "Go ahead. That night a year ago, when you said you were surviving something, what happened?" Norman considered his answer carefully. The story had been in all the papers, but not everyone followed local news closely. "My wife tried to poison me, along with her mother and several accomplices. They'd done it before to other men. I figured out their plan and turned the tables." Emma's eyes widened. "Jesus, the Granger case? That was you. That was me. I remember reading about it. Multiple murders, insurance fraud. How did you survive?" "By being more careful than they were smart." Emma shook her head slowly. "How do you trust anyone after something like that?" "Very carefully, and not very often." She studied his face, seeing something there that others might miss. The careful walls he'd built, the defensive mechanisms that had become second nature. That's a lonely way to live. Lonely is better than dead. Is it? The question hung between them like a challenge. Norman had asked himself the same thing many times over the past 2 years. The answer used to be simple. Safety trumped everything else. But lately, he'd begun to wonder if survival and living were the same thing that a young couple entered the pub, laughing and holding hands. They looked the way Norman and Betrayal must have looked once, before he knew what she really was. The sight should have filled him with bitterness, but instead he felt something unexpected. Not exactly envy, but a recognition of what he'd lost. "Maybe," he said finally, "but I'm not ready to find out yet." Emma nodded, understanding. "When you're ready, though, maybe we could have dinner sometime, somewhere that doesn't serve drinks." "Maybe." She smiled and stood, smoothing her skirt. "I should get back to work." "But Norman, take your time. Healing isn't a race." Norman watched her walk away, then finished his bourbon and left money on the table. Outside, the spring air carried the scent of blooming trees and distant rain. The city moved around him with its usual rhythm, full of people pursuing their own versions of happiness and safety. He drove home through familiar streets, past the courthouse where justice had been served, past the cemetery where his father was buried, past the house where he'd once believed in forever. The past was a map of scars now, but they were healing scars. The kind that made you stronger instead of just harder. The tea home. He poured himself a glass of wine from a bottle he'd opened himself, checked the locks on all the doors, and sat in his father's old chair to read. The same chair Betrayal had always hated, the one that reminded her of her victim. Now it was simply comfortable furniture in a house that belonged entirely to him. His phone sat silent on the side table. No manipulation disguised as affection. No calculated messages designed to lower his guard. Just quiet and the sound of pages turning and the knowledge that he'd survived something most people couldn't imagine. Norman Granger drank only from sealed bottles now. He verified ingredients in every meal, checked locks twice, and never fully trusted anyone who smiled too easily or asked too many questions. But he was alive. And maybe, someday soon, that would be enough to start building something new on the foundation of everything he'd learned. The wine tasted clean and honest, like a future without poison.